Everyone. My name is Baljot. As Norm very kindly introduced earlier, I recently just graduated from high school, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come and share some of my experiences and reflections with all of you here today. And I'd like to also extend my gratitude to Christina for inviting me to come and speak to all of you. And so, reflecting back on my life, though I still am young, I look at it as a mosaic of unique experiences, and some pieces of this mosaic fit together perfectly, whilst others required large amounts of mortar to be put together. And this comes from growing up in the middle of two cultures, an Indian household, but in Canadian society. It comes from being immersed in a variety of faiths, a Sikh community at home, but a Catholic school during the day. Comes from a deep interest in science, but also an equal passion for religion and faith, and those two communities don't always get well together. But I suppose we see a bit more of this mosaic in the world today. In our world of countless beautiful faiths and spiritualities, in our world of different and shared experiences, but it often takes a lot of time and mortar to put it all together, and I'd say that's most of the story of my life. After attending a Sikh faith-based school for 8 years, while living in a family that never really had strict religious or spiritual beliefs, I had the opportunity to forge a lot of my own path. And transitioning to St. Paul's from a Sikh school was quite the roller coaster, but it was also one of the greatest gifts I've ever received. And I think one of the greatest gifts I've received from the school was openness and understanding oneness. Now, I will use the term Sikh a lot throughout this presentation, so I thought I'd give a brief introduction to the faith. The Sikh faith is a monotheistic faith originating from northern India. It's based on many practices I actually see in Unitarian Universalism, practices and values of equality between people of all genders, people of all races, and people of socioeconomic status, and values of social justice, standing up for the vulnerable and oppressed, and standing up against injustice where it is seen. And so Sikhs have a few practices. They grow their hair out long, so mine for context comes down to just about here. And to us, it's a gift from God. And baptized Sikhs never cut their hair because it's a way of accepting how God or the Creator had made us. Sikhs also observe a lacto vegetarian diet, and we've had 10 gurus, sacred spirits in our history, manifestations of the divine, who came essentially as removers of the darkness to divided India in the 15th to 17th centuries. The faith emphasizes interfaith unity to a very large extent, and the Sikh scriptures contain writings not only from Sikhs, but also Hindus and Muslims. And so at St. Paul's, after 3 years of textbook-based religion learning, Grade 12 opened a new and unique opportunity for me, and that was to participate in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which by the end of the retreat became one of the best experiences of my life. Now, the spiritual exercises aren't necessarily what most high school seniors seek out for their grade 12 year. The course consists of 45 minutes to an hour of reflection, prayer, and journaling at the end of each and every single day, based off of the radical experiences that a self-obsessed prince turned saint had in the mountains of Spain. And you also have a weekly spiritual directors meeting. And so my spiritual director, I'd say, was a bit like St. Ignatius himself. He played in the WHL for 3 years, is known for having a video of him beating up another player on the ice, and has a lot of interesting experiences. And so there was obviously something to see over there. And in the spiritual exercise, now they have been adapted. Now traditionally how the exercises are done is it's a 30-day retreat. But high schoolers don't always have 30 days to leave the world and go into a retreat. So how it's done is it's broken up into 9 months of this prayer, reflection, and journaling at the end of every single day. And so though I was somewhat anxious beginning this intense course, it went on to be a very profound experience for me. And it was an experience that really spoke to me. It was an experience that gave me a lot of life and rejuvenation, but also an experience of oneness and understanding. And now, the fruits of this experience are uncountable. My 45 minutes in my study space in the basement with the lights off taught me more than perhaps any other class I've ever taken. But the exercises primarily revolve around placing yourself in a variety of situations. These situations can be very interesting. They range from holding the baby Jesus at his birth to having a one-on-one encounter with Satan. So quite the range. But the exercises also put faith into feeling for me. We often speak about loving the higher being or feeling at ease in prayer. And for me, the exercises were the opportunity to truly feel this after decades of, well, I haven't been alive for multiple decades, but it was the experience to truly feel this after hearing that faith should be felt, not heard, not preached, but also felt. And so I could go on and on about everything I've learned in the spiritual exercises, but the primary goal of this sermon is interfaith unity, trying to see one sacred spirit, one divine presence in everybody, which, let me admit, can be very hard. Now, the spiritual exercises are traditionally a Catholic practice, but as a Sikh, it never really felt as such. It felt universal. And I credit this to the fact that the reflections that we performed every single day in the spiritual exercises didn't aim at how we practiced faith or the different theological beliefs and practices we held, but they aimed right at the heart. They aimed to go deep down inside of you, to touch your conscience and your heart. And I'd say when it comes down to the heart, there's no difference between Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and everything in between. It's one shared spirit. And I found that to be one of the very, very beautiful things about this practice. Now, there were periods where we were asked to talk to Jesus, for example. And as a Sikh, this was perhaps something that was a bit bizarre. I've never been put in such a situation, so I chose to speak to one of the Sikh gurus. But eventually what happened was it became a lot easier to speak to a higher entity as such. And now I've been called radical for having this theory credited to myself. But what I believe is that if I look at the lives of the Sikh gurus, if I look at the life of Jesus, if I look at the life of Buddha, there's a lot of similarity. And there's this continued striving towards one goal. And I think that really indicates that it's not mere coincidence that there's shared miracles between these people. It's not mere coincidence that there's so much similarity in what's said. It's perhaps how it's meant to be. It's meant to be different practices with one goal. But I think that's been something that society's had a very hard time looking at. Now, whenever I'd practice my period of talking to a higher entity, it was really one unified spirit, and it was a spirit of love and care, a spirit that didn't exclude, but a spirit that aimed to include. It's not the theological practices that always aim to exclude. Sometimes it's the people that practice the faith that misinterpret it. Because at the end of the day, what we see between the many faiths of the world is that there's much similarity. They all preach love. They preach a faith that does action, a faith that looks out for the vulnerable and the oppressed. But those components of faith often seem to be buried down, especially when we hear conversations in which somebody says, well, my faith is truly the only way, or you might be partially saved, but not entirely until you believe in X, Y, and Z. And I've had to have many of those discussions. And I question when people say that, where is the principle of love thy neighbor as yourself? We live in a global village, undoubtedly, with many different faiths. That leads me to question, can we truly love someone as ourself when we see them as spiritually or religiously inferior, simply because they're different? Not entirely, because here we're not embracing our differences. Instead, we're highlighting them and using them as points of division. And so the components of faith that at least I see in society come out to the top, come to external appearance and external practice. And that isn't what religion really preaches at its core. And I've had a few experiences with this. So going to St. Paul's, for example, I've had the opportunity to meet with multiple archbishops and to participate in multiple retreats. And once I went to an out-of-school retreat where we were asked, would anyone like to speak during the service? And being the person who tries to have an appreciation of a variety of different beliefs, I enthusiastically put up my hand, but was told, unfortunately, you can't read at this service. And I asked why, and they were like, well, you don't necessarily look Catholic. What was actually worse was my friend, who was an outspoken atheist, was allowed to do the reading because he looked like he could pass as a Catholic. And so those are one of the experiences where we as people of different faiths have to try to unite. So my approach there was, well, can I ask you what the purpose of Catholic Mass is? and what the primary event that occurs within Catholic Mass is. And they said, well, it's to welcome the presence of Jesus through the Eucharist. And so I said, okay, I'd like to question to you, if we were back 2,000 years in history and Jesus was truly coming to a service with us, would he say that this person cannot read because he's different? And that's when the minister went silent, because Jesus would not have said this person cannot read because he's different. Because we live in a world where essentially the faiths aim to do unity, but we seem to take a lot of that away. And so a lot of that obviously does come from ignorance, but it also comes from not seeing the presence of God in others. And so after my entire explanation with this minister, the central idea really came down to outward signs of faith have been used as points of division for far too long. Now, my grandfather, who came to Canada in the 1970s, was often called Muslim. When the 9/11 attacks happened, he was often labeled as a terrorist, simply because he wore a turban, even though he came from a faith that practiced extremely different beliefs in theological practices than Islam. It was ignorance that causes this division, and I think it's education that's going to get us out. So grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you today. But internally, what we have to see is all the faiths have the same beautiful spirit. The ways we practice this faith, however, may be different. And it seems like we simply as a society cannot walk away from the theological and practical differences that we have in a faith, but we have to. In a nation like Canada, where we're a beautiful mosaic of faiths and spiritualities, we need to work harder to put it all together, because essentially there is so much beauty that can come from coexistence between different faiths that we as a society fail to see. And so the spiritual exercises asked us to do the opposite of what many of us in society end up doing. Instead of looking at the outside, for the first portion of the practice every single day, we're asked to look at all of the people we interacted with throughout the day. And then we're asked, where and how did you see God acting in them? Even in your enemies, how is a divine spirit acting through them? And this was a question put forward without the barrier of religion. And I think that's what really allowed it to flourish. Because I didn't say, well, this friend of mine wears a hijab, so I have to look at how God acts differently throughout them because they don't have the same beliefs as me. We believe in one unifying creator, and so with that, what it comes down to is seeing how God acts in a person and not how a person acts to represent God. And I think that's often the part we as a society end up missing. And so the experience really gave me the unexpected grace of trying to see God in everyone, in all of their actions, be it an insult or be it a hug. You try to see God in all of them. Sometimes you had to squint very hard, but it truly was possible. And this fits very well with a saying from the first Sikh guru. When Almighty God created one spirit and all belong to the same nature and carry the same spirit and source of life, then how is anybody superior or inferior based on their faith? And I think that's something that really resonated with me as I continue to walk through these hurdles of difference, which was highlighted, instead of looking towards unity. And I'd say that's really what I wish the world understood. And I'm glad that a lot of the congregation holds this belief, because when I had the opportunity to read into Unitarian Universalism, interfaith action with people from Unitarian Universalist organizations holds a lot of potential, because there's such a strong belief in unity, harmony, and oneness. Unity is in the title, so that does make sense. But in the modern world, we're plagued by war, division, and destruction. Truly is the time for all of us to come together, and there's incredible potential in this. The 1990s, for example, brought a large wave of interfaith dialogue promoting understanding, or at least most of the time. And that was an excellent start to coming together as a society, understanding the differences between what we believe. But I think that the courses of interfaith dialogue brought forward the differences. But I think one thing as a society we still have to look towards is the values of unity. An interfaith dialogue has to simply transcend words and be put into action. As St. Ignatius said, and I'll paraphrase because he used very elegant English there, love has to show in our actions. And I'd say it's easy for all of us to say, oh, well, I do love my neighbor as myself. But I think that saying truly comes true when we stop looking out just for ourselves, our communities, and the welfare of ourselves and our communities, but instead see one spirit in everyone and serve everyone. Because when we do come to this point of unity, I think it'll be impossible for a lot of us to sit down and be quiet and simply accept many things that go on in the world because we realize, there's a connection that we have. And so in every point of harm that occurs to this one person, I'm affected by it. Because my life isn't just what I do and what I see and the people I interact with, but it's affected by everything in the globe. And I think that comes from trying to see this one spirit, this one unity. But we have to get there first. And so when it really comes down to seeing love, seeing God in everybody, loving your neighbor as yourself, comes down to serving. And I think that's a call of action to all of us here today. And so I've had the opportunity to engage with folks from a variety of different faiths and spiritualities through the One and All Project, which was spoken about briefly before. It's an initiative that I had the opportunity to start. And the One and All Project involves an interfaith council of youth, and we work with various religious and spiritual communities and groups throughout the province, and hopefully nationally soon, to provide religious and spiritual resources for prisoners of minority faiths and spiritualities who for decades have faced large inequities due to ignorance. Now, how the project started was I was at the Gurdwara, which is the Sikh place of worship. I was in the Langar Hall, which is where everybody shares a communal meal, and someone came and sat next to me, and he was a young man, I'd say in his 30s, and he began speaking to me, and he asked me, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 16, or at least I was at the time. And then the next thing he said was, never do drugs. And I was like, well, great first sentence to say to somebody when you meet them. And he began to talk about how when he was young, he entered into this trap of drugs because he said he never really found a base and community for himself to flourish in. He said he was always lost and he felt alone. When he was imprisoned for 3 years, 6 months into his sentence, he began reflecting upon his life, went to the prison chaplain and said, well, I'm sick, and now that I'm looking to kind of rehabilitate, change my life, I'd like some resources from the Sikh religion. I'd like some Sikh scripture books. Now that was 6 months into his sentence. Now every month or 2 weeks after that, he continued to check in. 2.5 years later, he received nothing. And I think that just points out to the human rights violations that occur within our society today too. Because the Canadian Charter of Human Rights clearly does say that we all have the freedom of conscience and religion. And when somebody's incarcerated, it's the responsibility of the institution to uphold this. And so I was appalled by that, but when I looked into the situation further, it isn't just Sikh prisoners. It's Hindu prisoners, Jewish prisoners, Muslim prisoners, Buddhist prisoners, Indigenous prisoners, prisoners of smaller denominations and spiritualities. And when I questioned about this, what they said was there simply isn't enough of them for us to provide them with the accommodations they need. And I think when it comes down to people trying to see one spirit in everybody, that's a call to wake up for us. It's a call for us to continue to advocate more strongly for this love and unity that we need in the world amongst people of different faiths. Because until we develop that, we're going to remain a broken society, a society where not everybody's given the respect and dignity that they truly deserve. And so I've had the opportunity to work with a group of 12 wonderful teenagers, and we've got to provide over 2,000 resources to prisoners across the province. And recently, the project is working with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to provide Indigenous resources to Indigenous prisoners, because Indigenous prisoners are neglected just as much as they're overrepresented within the prison system. And so there's various points of action for all of us. And I think the title of this project is really what it aimed to do. The One and All Project, it aims to see one spirit in everybody, because we still continue to see difference. And so throughout the world, whilst we are seeing interfaith action, and we're seeing an uprise in interfaith action, there truly isn't enough. There isn't enough love being shown, there isn't enough unity being shown. Because what still continues to exist is I will serve this particular group, which is important, but issues extend beyond a specific group. It's a call for us to serve everybody to whatever capacity possible. And so the call really is to unite and engage together. So if religion, faith, and spirituality truly is a journey, then support on a journey is incredibly valuable. And as people of different faiths, we have a lot to contribute to each other, but we often don't look towards contributing. And so I was having a discussion earlier that, the Sikh faith has these values of equity, equality, and justice, and so does Unitarian Universalism, but it's a collaboration we haven't seen. So, there's so much potential we'd have if we work together because there's so much harmony we see, but sometimes it's that we're never able to look across the barriers to getting us to work together and to get us united. And so, my faith journey, for example, it isn't just the Sikh faith. Many people say that I practice a variety of different faiths. Now, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it's trying to have an appreciation for many different faiths, but it's that we can learn from every single faith in one way. So I am a Sikh. I do have Sikh beliefs, but I think something that I've picked up from the Catholic tradition is the idea of reflection or examine at the end of the day. Something I picked up from Buddhist or the Hindu faith is meditation and trying to find peace and calmness through that practice. There's so much we can enrich ourselves with, and there's so much we can enrich the world with if we simply look to each other, if we simply look to people of different faiths and come together with this message of unity. And so even though I may wear a turban on my head, or my friend may wear a hijab or a kippah, we aren't really all that different. We're one, created and united by one Spirit. And so the call is to see the Spirit and to serve the Spirit. Thank you.